if we're gonna argue biblically and use this as our authority, it would be very unwise to go evidence for evidence and say, yeah, I'll set my Bible on the shelf and I'll meet you in, quote, the scientific realm.
That is why you fail.
Welcome back, everyone, to Bridge the Divide, where I examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how we, with education, rationality, and reason, can bridge the societal divides that they create. Well, you all endured the first part, and despite that pain, you demanded the second. So without any further ado, let's dive into part 2 of our look into the twisted reality of Eric Hovind.
This whole evolutionary concept that life came from non-life, it actually violates a law of science.
So that guy you just saw was Bodhi Hodge. He's a friend of Eric Hovind's, and he also works as a writer, researcher, and speaker for Answers in Genesis. And that clip that Eric used of him was pulled directly from the creationist propaganda film Genesis: Paradise Lost, a movie that was really just an evolution hate piece filled with paid AIG talking heads like Ray Comfort, Ken Ham, and Vadi Beauchamp. And in just that tiny clip, Bodhi Hodge, with his MS in mechanical engineering, makes 3 massive errors. And he does this because he literally has zero business talking about evolution or anything even related to biology. First, Hodge refers to abiogenesis as life from non-life, which of course is a grossly oversimplified description of the complex chemical process that leads to the formation of the building blocks of RNA and DNA. Second, he states that abiogenesis is an evolutionary idea when it absolutely isn't. It's a biology idea. Abiogenesis and evolution are only related because they are both areas that are explored within the massive field of biology. Abiogenesis deals with the process by which pre-life chemical reactions gave rise to life under the appropriate conditions, whereas evolution deals with the process by which changes occur over time due to the effects of natural selection upon populations. The former deals with the origin, the latter deals with the diversification. It is of course a blatant misrepresentation of both fields, primarily because the established fact of evolution is in no way predicated upon the truth of abiogenesis, which leads us to the third mistake, and that is that Hodge is basically lying when he refers to abiogenesis here, because what he's actually referring to here is the now long debunked theory of spontaneous generation, and he's just calling it abiogenesis. And it is all kinds of twisted that in just 5 seconds so many mistakes could be made. But unfortunately for them, that is the level of blatant dishonesty that creationists must commit themselves to keep their position alive. It's also why these reality-denying cultists are so insidious, because while this information may be old hat to those of us who chose to stay in school, it is completely foreign to their vastly undereducated congregations, thus allowing them to be so easily taken advantage of by these grifters.
It is one of the only laws in biology. It's called the law of biogenesis. It says that life comes from life, not non-life.
I'm starting to feel like I repeat this one thing way too often when it comes to creationist bullshit. Biogenesis is not a scientific law.
I am the law!
Back here in reality, given our current level of understanding, all biogenesis really does is describe the fact that organisms can reproduce. Now, the concept of biogenesis arose way back in the 19th century from the work of Louis Pasteur and John Tyndall in direct response to the proposed scientific theory of spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation held that living organisms could arise from non-living matter, such as fleas could arise from dust, maggots could arise from rotting meat, or mice could arise from moldy wheat or unwashed clothes. Now, when it comes to biogenesis, we have to keep one very important thing in mind, and that is that a scientific law is a statement based on repeated experiments or observations that predicts or describes a range of natural phenomena. In order for biogenesis to actually become a scientific law,
I am the law.
it must first be demonstrated unequivocally that life arising from complex chemical reactions is an impossibility. But of course, even if it were ever able to do that, it still would not be evidence that supported their God hypothesis. And that's because the claim that they make that the only options available to us are creationism or abiogenesis is of course a false dichotomy. Ultimately, what Hodge is doing here is spewing another nonsense creationist claim that's cloaked in scientific language intended to fool the gullible. And really, the only reason that creationists refuse to accept any of this is because at this current time, abiogenesis is still a working hypothesis. A strong working hypothesis, but a hypothesis nonetheless. Science starts from the observation that life is currently on the planet. Then it takes into consideration the evidence that life was not always here on the planet. So then it asks the obvious question, how did life arise on the planet? And then it steadily works that problem utilizing all of the evidence that we've accumulated since origin of life exploration began. Creationists, however, eschew all of the evidence and instead fall back on an ancient myth of a god that specially created the earth and all the life on it, because ultimately, if all of life was specially created, then that also means that they were specially created. And that is where they have been indoctrinated to derive their personal value.
I love you. Now, it's your turn. Say you love me.
The law of biogenesis.
It's not a law.
I am the law. That says all life comes from pre-existing life, and yet evolution says that life can come from non-life.
This is Dr. Charles Jackson, friend of Eric Hovind and resident scientist for the Creation Truth Foundation. And given his multiple science degrees, his educational doctorate, and his lifetime membership in Mensa, something that Eric desperately loves to remind people of, I'm not going to say that he's wrong. I'm going to say that he's flat out lying. Evolution describes the change in heritable traits within populations over successive generations. Abiogenesis aims to describe the complex chemical process that gave rise to early life given the appropriate conditions. These are two completely different things.
Surprise if you just wait long enough.
Yeah, Chuck, it does take time. Vast amounts of time. Just because you say it with a snarky tone doesn't make it false.
But you know what? We see no examples of that today. We can't observe it. We can't repeat it.
Yeah, and if you actually understood what the hell it was you were talking about, Hodge, you'd know why that is. Forgetting for a moment about the mechanistic steps within abiogenesis, you have to remember that for the process of abiogenesis to occur using the elements necessary for life, there cannot be any competition for those elements. So, after life arises and begins to steadily multiply everywhere, all of those necessary elements and any potential life that might arise from them are now a part of that wonderful thing that we call the food chain. Essentially, any existing life is already appropriating all of those necessary elements for their own continued survival and replication. And even if new life were to get the opportunity to form, that new life would quickly be seized upon by the life that already exists. And this is precisely why all of the physical work in origin of life research takes place in extremely sterile conditions, so as to ensure that the already existing life on this planet is not given the opportunity to wreck the experiments by, say, contaminating or consuming them.
People just believe it blindly.
No, Hodgepodge, we don't believe it blindly. For like the 1000th time, beliefs are not chosen, they're what we're convinced of. And we are convinced of the likelihood of abiogenesis for 3 reasons. 1, the evidence alone is staggering. 2, because there is zero evidence to indicate the existence of a god or even that a godlike entity was necessary for the process. And 3, because science isn't really in the habit of inserting unjustifiable answers into the gaps in its knowledge just because it makes him feel all tingly inside.
I feel all tingly inside. Should we stop?
Hey everyone, Editing JL here. Sorry for the interruption, but something occurred to me while I was putting this all together, and that was, if this is Bodhi's standard for evidence...
But you know what? We see no examples of that today. We can't observe it. We can't repeat it. People just believe it blindly.
And his epistemology holds, then he really has no business claiming much of what he believes in the Bible to be true. Let's check out the next video.
When they read their textbooks and it's talking about changes in finches' beaks or changes you see in dogs, the word evolution is used.
Oh shit, it's the old ham bone himself. Ken Ham, of course, needs no introduction. I mean, the asshole already conned the state of Kentucky into utilizing taxpayer money to construct his monument to human stupidity. But yeah, Ken, when learning the history behind the development of evolutionary theory, students typically learn about Darwin's finches and about the artificial selection that human beings employed to get the breeds of dogs we have today. But when it comes to Darwin's finches, you forget forgot the most important thing, Ken, and that's that they are an excellent example of insular biogeography, or island biogeography. A branch of biogeography, island biogeography, examines the factors that affect a species' diversification in isolated communities. The field itself was started back in the 60s by Robert H. MacArthur and E.O. Wilson, and is considered today to be some of the best evidence of evolution.
But then the word evolution is also used for molecules to man, so it's a bait and switch.
Of course, Ken Ham doesn't know what a bait and switch fallacy is. For his edification, a bait and switch fallacy occurs when a person presents a partial appealing truth while hiding an unappealing falsehood. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised that Ken doesn't know that, because it's a tactic that is often utilized in cults and authoritarian settings to conceal doctrine from outsiders and new inductees. While Ham's derisive molecules to man statement is of course a gross oversimplification of over 3 billion years of evolution on this planet, it's not a bait and switch, because island biogeography and artificial selection are both evolutionary concepts. It's just that island biogeography is talking about evolution in an isolated setting, and artificial selection is talking about when specific phenotypic traits are selected by an outside agent, meaning us humans, instead of random forces of nature.
Just like all the other sequences, like chimps gradually turning into humans.
Wow. Someone needs to revoke Chucky's educational doctorate, because we know that chimpanzees did not turn into humans because chimpanzees exist today. We also know from the evidence that modern chimpanzees and modern humans shared a common ancestor that lived in between 8 and 6 million years ago.
And this little Bambi-looking thing turning into horses.
It has a name, Chuckles, and it's Hyracotherium. Hyracotherium is a genus of extinct, small, fox-sized animals and is often considered the earliest known member of Equidae, the taxonomic family of horses, including donkeys and zebras. If you're gonna attack something, Chuck, at least have the intellectual honesty to know the name of what you're attacking.
Those kinds of things that have been used for evolution really don't belong in the textbooks.
The evolutionary lineage from Hyracotherium to modern-day horses is extremely well understood, because there is mountains of evidence to back it up. So, seeing that it is demonstrably true, it absolutely should be in textbooks.
Alan Fiducia, the head of biology at UNC Chapel Hill.
For those who may not be familiar, Chuck here is referring to John Alan Fiducia, who is a paleornithologist specializing in the origins, evolution, and phylogeny of birds.
Says that it will be the paleontological embarrassment of the 20th century, the idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs.
While Fiducia has published a large number of peer-reviewed papers in ornithological and biological journals, he has also become a somewhat controversial figure in his field for his overwhelming rejection of the theropod-to-bird hypothesis that modern-day birds are deeply nested within theropoda, that clade of dinosaurs characterized by hollow bones and 3 toes and claws on each limb. In opposition, Fiducia has proposed that birds did not evolve from theropods, but instead shared a common stem ancestor with theropods, and actually evolved from small arboreal archosaurs in the Triassic. Unfortunately for him, Fiducia has come under extreme criticism for his consistent failure to utilize cladistics in his studies. But what should be of particular note is that Fiducia is not arguing against evolution itself. He's merely arguing for a different version of evolution as it pertains to birds. So for anti-evolutionists to directly cite a scientist whose entire body of work is predicated upon the truth of evolution is at best monumentally stupid and at worst egregiously deceptive.
They're not a related lineage at all.
Yeah, they are, and if you want the evidence for that, Chuckster, why don't you go and talk to the scientists that you just completely misrepresented? But I'm guessing that, kind of like what Mary Schweitzer does these days, he'll probably screen your call. Let's move on to the next video.
We've got to go past what Darwin taught us.
We have gone past what Darwin taught us. In fact, since Darwin died back in 1882, there's been, say, 141 years of correction, improvement, and advancement on his original ideas. Despite how much creationists like to hang their hat on it, Darwin was not the end-all be-all when it comes to evolution. He made some compelling observations, yes, but he also got a lot wrong. Which is why today, 141 years later, we don't really cite Darwin as being anything other than the father of evolutionary biology.
We've got to move past this idea because it's not healthy.
Oh shit, I smell the rancid stink of pseudoscience in the air.
It's actually hindering, it's actually hurting science because it's forcing scientists to look at the data through the lens of Darwinian evolution being true.
That's not how science works, Eric, and you know that because I have heard multiple people explain it to you. If Darwin had been completely and utterly wrong in everything that he had proposed, then everything he proposed would eventually be disproven and discarded. But of course it wasn't, because Darwin's early observations of the effects of evolution were on point. And since his time, hundreds of thousands of evolutionary biologists from all around the world have taken that ball and ran with it. The result of which has been every single advancement that we have made in medicine, agriculture, and animal husbandry that all of us enjoy today. Ultimately, Eric, we know that our interpretations of the evidence which lead to the conclusion of evolution is true because the predictions we make that are predicated upon those interpretations also come true. If our interpretations of the evidence were wrong in any way, then those predictions could not come true. It really is as simple as that. So my advice to you, Eric, is to stop being a dishonest wiener who cites Darwin all the time and start acknowledging the 141 years of advancement we've made in between Darwin's death and today.
And then forcing them to interpret the data with that lens rather than saying, hey, what are our options?
Oh, why couldn't Kent have just saved us the headaches from your ignorant prattling by finishing on your mother's back? There are no other options, Eric. None. And that's because the evidence indicates that Darwin was correct in his very early observations, and the predictions we make utilizing that information come true, which in turn confirms that our interpretations of those observations was correct.
What could it be out there?
Nothing other than evolution. Well, at least he didn't ruin all our days by diving into social Darwinism. Let's see what the next video has for us.
I think people just don't understand how important they really are. See, they've been convinced by people who have rejected the existence of God that they're nothing but an evolved ape. They're just an animal.
Looks like Chris Ashcraft is back and is once again making claims that he can't support. First and foremost, people are important. It's just that the extent of their importance is of course entirely subjective. Secondly, there are tens of thousands of educators out there who are religious and also understand the truth of evolution. My own biology teacher back in high school was a Christian, as were my biology and forensics professors in college. So sorry to burst your bubble, Chris, but your claim that only people who've rejected your God teach these things is patently false. And I have to mention the fact that taxonomically we are classified in the family of Hominidae, which makes up a very, very tiny portion of the kingdom of Animalia, is certainly in no way an insult. It's just a way of biologically classifying us amongst all the other living organisms on the planet. If anything, it should be humbling knowing that we are ancestrally interconnected with every other living organism on this planet. To call me a primate, or even just an animal, isn't degrading. Dude, it is fucking awesome.
Not understanding how truly, truly important they really are.
Being classified as primates or even as animals does not reduce our importance. As far as the planet's biodiversity goes, we are extremely important as a species. In the distant past, as an apex predator species, we maintained biodiversity by keeping various megafauna in check. But today, we're even more important as a species because we have the ability to actively improve and maintain or even completely destroy the biodiversity of the planet. No God is necessary for human beings to be important or to recognize their importance. Just being a major influential part of the biogeography of the Earth is more than enough.
I mean, this world did not form all by itself through purely natural processes. It was made by an almighty God to be a habitat for us.
Not only was that a positive claim, Chris, but it's a positive claim for which you have zero evidence. To put it in relatively simple terms, humans evolved to what we are today in response to the evolutionary pressures that nature randomly threw at us. And there is an astonishingly massive amount of evidence to back all this up.
But it's more than that. It's more than just a suitable place to live. Within the world that God made for us, you can see love.
Yeah, love is the name we give to the powerful feelings that result from the presence of pair bonding hormones such as oxytocin and vasopressin. And our brain's ability to produce those things is a direct result of our evolution.
He didn't just make a world that had the plants and things that we needed to live, and food to eat and water to drink and air to breathe.
Correct. Your God did not do any of those things because your God did not exist to do them.
But there's enjoyment here. There's beauty here. I mean, we enjoy this place because he made it that way. He made it with beautiful sights.
Humans think some things are beautiful because God has arbitrarily made them beautiful to us. That is some next level backwards thinking. Apart from the total and complete devaluation of beauty itself, this is of course just one more claim that Chris can't back up without begging the question.
Beautiful sounds, the birds, beautiful smells. I mean, he made the world that we were able to enjoy.
Hey, Chris, do you have any evidence to back up all of this preachy nonsense?
And you can see his love in what has been made. People don't understand their importance.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Let's see what we have next.
You guys might remember in the fall of 2021, the National School Board Association wrote their letter to President Biden.
The guy speaking to Eric is John Stamper. For those unfamiliar with him, he's a former PE teacher from Chicago turned Christian author and homeschool instructor, something that he accomplishes through the YouTube channel Master Books, which is a homeschool channel offering Christian homeschool curriculum for all of those ignorant parents out there who want to ensure no actual educators interfere with their child's cult indoctrination. Now, in this particular conversation, what Stamper's referring to is a 2021 letter sent to President Biden from the National School Boards Association. Now, if you would like to read the letter yourself, I have put a link to it down in the description for you.
Asking him to deploy the FBI, the DOJ, Homeland Security to put a stop to these parents speaking out at school boards, saying that the parents were basically being domestic terrorists. If you guys remember that.
While the letter does solicit the expertise and resources of the DOJ, the FBI, Homeland Security, the Secret Service, the National Threat Assessment Center, and the Post Office for a joint collaboration with the NSBA to focus on dealing with escalating threats of violence in regards to things like mask mandates and critical race theory, it in no way calls for the government to descend on school board meetings like the Gestapo to arrest dissenting parents. These particular parents weren't just speaking out, Stamper. Parents have been speaking out and dissenting at school board meetings for decades. This letter was sent to the president in response to the extreme nationwide rise in physical threats of violence towards educators from ignorant parents who are more interested in their feelings than in the truth.
Yes. A.G. Garland backed them up a couple days later with his own letter.
True, A.G. Merrick Garland did back the NSBA and actually attempted to address some of their concerns. Unfortunately, the NSBA and Garland encountered enormous pushback from the right, with many of them claiming that the letter was unfairly targeting concerned parents. But just being a concerned parent is a far cry from threatening to hunt down and kill an educator over enforcing mask mandates. While some of the wording in the letter may have been more alarmist than necessary, the NSBA was certainly justified in approaching the federal government for assistance with a threat that they felt was beyond their means to address. But as is usually the case, politics got involved and as always screwed the pooch.
So that was in the fall of 2021. You have the most powerful agencies in the country getting behind this movement to just basically keep parents out of it.
That's blatantly false, Stamper. There is no movement to keep parents out of their children's education, and there is no movement to chill the free speech of parents during public meetings between school boards and their communities. And, thanks to rabid Christian nationalism, now there's no movement to stop ignorant parents from openly threatening school officials either.
We know who you are. We know who you are. You can leave freely, but we will find you, and we know who you are. You will never be allowed in public again.
Then just give us your children and parents get out of the way sort of thing. It's not a small thing. It goes all the way to the most powerful agencies that our country has.
Not anymore, it doesn't. But hey, we never really expected an ex-PE teacher who now advocates for Christian homeschooling on YouTube to really understand the nuances of what an actual education is. Let's move on to the last video.
If you have ever seen Cosmos, either Neil deGrasse Tyson, the new version of Cosmos, or portions of it, or Carl Sagan, the original Cosmos that they require to be teaching in school.
I am a huge fan of Cosmos, A Personal Voyage, hosted by Carl Sagan back in 1980. Its 2014 follow-up, Cosmos, A Spacetime Odyssey, hosted by Neil Tyson, and the 2020 Cosmos Possible Worlds, also hosted by Tyson. However, in response to what Eric just said, I remember having to watch Cosmos at home, and I have no memory of it ever being required in the classroom. In fact, I was unable to find a record of Cosmos or anything else on PBS being required viewing by any school district. Fun fact: the Tyson-hosted Cosmos would have never been able to be produced or aired if not for the financial contribution of the wonderfully irreverent Seth MacFarlane.
Hamburger.
It, to me, is mind-boggling to watch Cosmos.
That's okay, Eric. Sometimes lessons in science are just too complicated for people to follow, even when extremely knowledgeable science communicators are presenting the information in the most easily digestible form possible.
and how they'll show the moon forming. They'll just show all these comets coming and making the moon, and it was 200,000 miles closer to the Earth.
So for his own video, Eric has hacked together clips from the very first episode of Tyson's Cosmos series, the one where he's walking along the famous cosmic calendar and explaining all of the major events in our cosmic history. A part of that history is the formation of our moon, which is generally thought to have formed from the resulting ejecta from a collision between the early Earth and another smaller planet, likely the size of Mars. And given the timescales of accretion, the growing distance between the Earth and the moon, physics, and orbital mechanics, we can estimate that when the moon first formed around 4 billion years ago, that it was in an orbit roughly 20,000 miles away. So Eric was pretty close. The moon was actually 218,900 miles closer to Earth.
So we're talking about a moon 73,000 miles away from planet Earth?
No, Eric, we're talking about a moon 20,000 miles away from Earth. A considerably long amount of time would have had to have passed for it to be 73,000 miles from Earth, roughly 424,000 years after its formation, given that the moon drifts further away from the Earth at a rate of 3.8 centimeters per year, or 12.5 feet per century. You gotta pay attention, Eric. Math is important.
Do you realize what kind of problems you have there?
Only the ones you fabricated out of your ignorance, Eric.
The inverse square law would take effect and the moon and the Earth would just crash into each other.
Eric, I'm just going to tell you straight up. Do not cite scientific terminology if you don't know how it applies, or even less what it actually means. The inverse square law of gravitation states that the force of gravity is inversely proportional to the square of the distance that separates that object from the Earth's center. So, if one object is on the Earth and the moon is 60 times farther away from the Earth, then the force of Earth's gravity on the moon will be 1/60th squared times that of the force exerted on the closer object. So, as scientific laws are wont to do, the inverse square law is describing the gravitational relationship between objects with mass, namely Earth and other surrounding objects. And sure, given their individual masses, the moon would have just crashed back into the Earth. That is, of course, if the moon didn't have its own velocity counteracting the gravitational force of Earth and pulling it into an orbit. When the ejecta that formed the moon shot into space after the collision, that material was traveling at a minimum of 11.2 kilometers per second. But after entering space, the Earth's gravitational pull combined with the ejecta's velocity pulled it into an orbit. And then over time, because there is no atmospheric drag in space, that ejecta will maintain its orbital velocity and eventually accretes into the satellite we now call the moon. So like I said, Eric, you really shouldn't talk about shit you know nothing about.
Was the Earth created or did the Earth evolve?
Well, the Earth certainly wasn't created, at least not in the context that you're using that word, Eric. A better description would be that the Earth formed as a result of the gravitational forces working upon it. And also, Eric, I'd like to point out that you're using the term evolve inappropriately. Evolution refers specifically to the change in heritable traits over successive generations and populations. Planets don't have heritable traits. They are literally balls of rock and metal or dense gases. Now, they can change as a result of the random cosmic forces exerted upon them, but they obviously don't have heritable traits to pass on to offspring. Were an asteroid to, say, strike the Earth and wipe out all life as we know it, then the planet certainly would have changed from habitable to inhabitable. And while technically you could describe that change as a kind of evolution, it's really not an appropriate use of that term, seeing as we have more accurate terms to choose from.
When you watch these shows, they make it just sound like, of course it evolved. Of course that happened.
At no point have I ever heard Neil Tyson or Carl Sagan or any other astrophysicist or cosmologist state that the Earth evolves in the same context as biological organisms. Like I said, using the term evolve as a colloquial, like Eric is doing here, to simply express change is inappropriate and in some contexts downright deceptive.
And when you pay close attention, you're going, it's absurdity. It's fairy tales. They're making this stuff up.
First, no, we are not just making it up. We have mountains of evidence to support these conclusions. Second, when you insult thousands of years of scientific endeavor and novel predictions that validate our interpretation of evidence by claiming it's all fairy tales, then turn around and instead of explaining mechanistically with evidence to support how our predictive models are all incorrect, you offer an alternative explanation which is literally a sky fairy that magicked everything into existence, that there's no evidence for this entity because it mysteriously values faith over knowledge, and you only know this to be true from your inaccessible and unverifiable internal experience, you're literally wearing your willful ignorance and your hypocrisy on your sleeves.
It is not scientific whatsoever.
It absolutely is, Eric. Like I said before, novel predictions validate our interpretations of evidence when they come true, which of course is something that will never happen using your God as an explanation for anything. And that will conclude this look at the mind-bending deceptive idiocy of Eric Hovind and the gaggle of liars that he pays to be his sycophants. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, July is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. A link on how you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you love scary movies, be sure to check out me and my filmmaker friends over at the Week in Horror podcast, now in our 4th season. Everything you need to become a channel member here, get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear, support the podcast, or even get your own official Darth, Dawkins Squeak toy is in the description below. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.